Welcome to the second episode of Deer Dirt. Last week, I mentioned that I was going to talk about how to make an honest assessment of a hunting property. So the real question is, how good can this farm be? And I talked a little bit about the farm right here where I'm standing. This is land that I bought, and it wasn't a great hunting property when I bought it. So the real question is, why did you buy it? So we're going to break that down. We're going to take a look at this farm as an example, and obviously I had enough faith in what it could become to shell out the money to purchase it. So let's take a little tour around, and I'll tell you why I bought it and what I think the upside is, honestly, for this piece of property. Right behind me is a food plot, and one of the main ingredients of a great whitetail hunting property is the ability to put in food. I've always said that if you find the food, you find the deer. So if you've got a property, let's say it's almost solid timber, those are a lot tougher to supply a high amount of food to the deer because you have to go in and you have to make openings. Whereas this farm had a lot of natural openings. Like I said, behind me is one of them. It's about a 3.5 acre valley. This was a cattle farm, so all of this was in pasture. But that little valley behind me had pretty good black dirt. So I figured if nothing else, I can grow food in there. And there's a few other spots on the farm too that just set up really well for that. So that was an important ingredient of this property. So if you're looking at a farm either that you own or that you have permission on, or even if you're considering buying it, whatever it may be, one of the keys is, how can I provide food? How can I make this place more attractive to the deer? It's not necessarily from a straight up nutrition standpoint because, especially here in Iowa, the deer don't really want for something to eat. It's more about making the property itself more attractive. Like, how can I bring deer into this property and how can I hold them here? How can I make this farm itself more huntable? So I'd say on this farm, there are a half a dozen plus little small food plot locations. The one behind me is one. There's another one in front of me that's probably about 4 acres in size, spread out over a couple of different spots. There's a place coming up the driveway that's a couple of acres. Up on the ridge behind me, there's a few more spots that I opened up that were old pasture that are now food plots. So I think you want to have close to 5% of the property ideally would be available for supplemental food, which means food plots. Ag fields don't really count because once they're harvested, it might be months before there's food in those locations again. So you want to have, like I said, roughly 5% of the total acres available for year-round, ideally, food plots for the deer. Obviously, if the property is big woods, you probably need more than 5%. Because now you're going to be pulling deer from all over the place. If it's intensely ag, 5% is plenty, because there's a lot of additional food there during the summer, and you can fall back on your 5%, during the fall and winter, and the deer won't eat the whole thing. So that number is kind of flexible. So if you look at the aerial photos, and there's a lot of opportunities right here on the HuntStand app to pull up and study not only where the openings might be, but even the cropping history, month by month changes, what's been planted in some of these fields in the past by the farmers in that area, how much food is available. That's super important. Again, find the food, find the deer. So let's move on. Let's start looking at the next element is going to be cover. So we got 3 things: food, cover, water. That's what the deer want. And they want security as well, but we can talk about that separately. Food, cover, water. So let's look at cover next. So another thing that you want to look at, it doesn't necessarily impact whether or not the property can produce big deer or produce deer in general. It really has more to do with how huntable it's going to be, and that's the access, the ability to get to and from different parts of the property without the deer knowing. As you look to my right up this valley, there's a really cool little corridor here of trees that I can use to access up into this food plot. Just those types of locations, when you're looking at the layout of the property, again, the aerial photos that you can pull off the HuntStand app, those things are going to show you, almost all of this type of information that you need. Another thing is, how do you access the whole property? If you only have one way in, like one driveway, and that's the only way you can come into it, that's probably not quite as conducive to, let's say, huntability as if you can access it from different directions. Because if you have wind blowing from the south, you want to be able to access it, from the north. And if the wind is from the north, you want to be able to access it from the south. You always want to be able to come into the property itself with the wind in your face. So again, when you're assessing the huntability, the access to the property itself makes a difference, not just to each individual stand location. This next spot that we're going to look at is, this is one of the timber stand improvement TSI locations on this farm. When I looked at the property, one of the keys, one of the big green lights for me was the fact that there weren't a lot of invasive species growing here on the farm. I didn't want to come in here and then not be able to make the improvements to the habitat. The deer do better in an area with more browse, thicker ground cover. In my experience, you can hold more bucks, more older age class bucks in thick habitat than you can in open habitat. I just think that they don't interact as much when it's thick, and that means that they tolerate each other at maybe a little bit higher densities than they would if it was real open and they can see each other from a long ways away. So this is one of the spots on the farm that I did a little bit of that kind of work. I cut down some cedar trees. Cedars are, little pockets of them are fine, but when you get big, expansive areas, they shade everything else out and nothing else is going to grow in there. So I started cutting the cedars down, and we'll be able to see here, what a huge improvement that it made from, before and after. And that's just one spring growing season. Shows you how much the underbrush responded to that sunlight coming through the open canopy. So again, the ability to do that is important. It makes your farm a lot better, your property a lot better, but you don't want to do that if the understory is full of invasive species, because then when you open up the canopy, all you're doing is encouraging those invasive species to go crazy. So again, like I said, that's one of the assessments. You don't want to, if you can, purchase or do a whole bunch of habitat work on a property that has a lot of invasives. You have to deal with them first, which can be really time consuming and really labor intensive. So again, that was a thumbs up for me. So you're looking at, why did you buy this farm? Well, we're up to two things so far. The ability to plant food plots. It was a pasture farm, so there was no food here. So there's going to be a lot of upside when you started putting food on. And then the ability to improve the habitat, whether it was going into the steeply sloped areas. And you can tell, again, you go back to the hybrid topo maps, the hybrid aerial photo that shows the topographical lines over top of the aerial photos. And you can tell that some of these slopes are really steep, too steep to plant food plots on. So there are going to be places where you can create the habitat. So when it comes to making sure that there aren't any invasives, you really have to go into the timber to make sure of that. You're not going to pull that off any of the layers on HuntStand. So now we've got two positives going for this property: the ability to create food and the ability to improve and create habitat. So we got one thing left to check. So my criteria number 3, I'm fortunate enough to have a whole bunch of these stock ponds, these cattle ponds on this property. I think I counted them up one time, and there's about 10 of them, just little small ones like this one to my right. They're scattered all over the place. That is the beauty of a pasture farm, is because the farmers, they don't want to bring water to the cows, so they create all these ponds. Well, once the cows are off there, of course, those are prime locations for the deer to use too. And the beauty of this farm is it also has a flowing spring on it, so you have fresh water all the time. So even if these little ponds were to dry up, which potentially I guess they could, it's been such a dry year, I hope they don't, but if they do, then I still have that the spring that's kicking water out. Also, deer get a high percentage of the moisture that they need in their daily diet just from what they eat. In the mornings there's dew on the leaves of the plants that they're eating. The plants themselves have moisture in them. So they don't have this huge need for water. But when it gets really dry, especially late summer, when a lot of the plants are they're not lush anymore, they're getting kind of, stemmy, then the water becomes a lot more attractive. So those are the three things. You want to be able to, like I said, create food, cover, water. And then if you're saying, what is the big picture? Like, can I produce deer? Well, if you hit those three things, you can produce deer in most parts of the United States. The question of can I produce trophy class or big antlered deer, that's a little bit different question. That one is going to really come back to the neighborhood. And we talked about that quite a bit in episode number 1. So I'm not going to go back over that again. But if the properties that border the one that you're looking at, the one that you own, the one that you have permission on, whatever the case may be, the one that you're trying to assess, if the people who hunt those properties are, making some effort, let's say on the management side, shooting some does, passing some of the younger bucks, then the quality of the hunting is going to be really good. Again, you're only as good as your neighbors unless you own thousands and thousands of acres. So I'd encourage you to take a really honest assessment of the property, and if something is substandard, just realize that you can fix it. Well, I appreciate you joining me this week. I'll be right back here again soon with another episode of Deer Dirt.